Thank you for joining us for this second installment in Agile's Teachers as Frontline Workers video series. We're excited to have here with us again today Dr. Sheryl Ziegler to talk about the increasing trend of teachers quitting that's currently impacting the education system. So welcome back, Sheryl.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here and talking about this really important topic.
So before we get into today's discussion, can you summarize the key takeaways from your part one session of this series?
So I think in part one, we wound up talking a lot about secondary PTSD. There's a couple different words. So it's compassion fatigue, vicarious traumatization, or secondary PTSD that teachers have been experiencing, and then sort of the outcomes of that. So I think the first part of this sets up that we understand that teachers themselves are in crisis, that the profession of teaching is under question, what's going to happen to it, and some of those mental health factors that have contributed to their own mental health, really as a consequence of also seeing the deterioration of youth mental health in our country. So it's very much almost a parallel process. You can't be working with highly traumatized kids or a whole entire population under stress and then not take that burden on yourself. And then it has a direct impact not only to how you're doing the work, but actually if you choose to stay in the profession, or how effective you are within your role, and just how your mental and physical health are impacted. So that was really part one. And I'm looking forward to this part two, really on the impact that it has when you have record levels of teachers leaving the field, and all of the things that on a state and national level, school districts are doing to respond to this need, I think is a really important next step of this conversation.
What do you think about the current state of teachers quitting? Is the most important thing that you think should be on every administrator's radar right now?
I'm glad you asked it as every administrator, because a lot of times our conversations around everything that needs to be done within schools is very focused on teachers. And we are going to talk about teachers, but I also think it's really important to highlight it starts with school leadership. It starts with administrations. It can start at the school board level and superintendents and then principals. And so really making sure that we start this conversation off with saying that everything we talk about starts from the top, and it starts with leadership. But one of the things that I think is really important to talk about is the high rates of teachers that are leaving teaching. They're leaving, many of these teachers, this was their dream job. This was something they always wanted to do. In many cases, these are very seasoned and experienced teachers. So teachers with 10, 15, 20 years of experience that were not planning on leaving this soon, that they are actually exiting earlier. So to frame this up, I wrote down some of the things. So a survey conducted by the Illinois Department of Education. So I'm going to cover different parts of the country so people understand this is all over. This is not just in one certain location or just for inner cities or rural areas. This is something that we're really seeing across the board. So when the survey was conducted by Illinois, it revealed that 88% of 663 school districts surveyed had a teacher shortage. So 88%, so essentially 9 out of 10 schools. The shortage has become chronic in several states. So, for example, in the West, Nevada has approximately 300 unfulfilled positions. Florida has 8,000 unfulfilled positions. In Texas, the 5 largest school districts in the Houston area, because anybody who knows that area, Houston is very, very vast and spread out, they have nearly 2,000 vacancies. So we're talking about vacancies that are in the thousands, and we're also talking about problems that are truly systemic and nationwide.
That is so significant. So what are some reasons why are teachers quitting?
The shortage comes from 2 main reasons. The first one is the decline of the number of college students that are pursuing education degrees. So let's just pause with that first one. That's a very sad state to think that we have young people who are just not seeking education degrees or the education field, that being a teacher is maybe not the same level of excitement or the dream that generations before them had.
Well, and you can imagine, having grown up in what is more like what the situation is now, you can really understand why there might be less interest in that.
Absolutely. I've talked with high school juniors and seniors who say, I feel like I just survived my high school years. Why would I want to work in a building where I think that a student might shoot me, where I don't feel support, where teaching is considered the number one most stressful occupation? It has now surpassed nursing, which was historically number one. So yeah, you can see that, right? Why would you choose to sign up for that? So that's the first reason. The second reason is that the experienced teachers are just simply leaving the profession. So between we don't have enough young new teachers coming in and we've got seasoned teachers that are exiting early, we've got this massive shortage. And again, with when you get the reputation, it's different to say, hey, being a teacher is one of the most stressful jobs that you can have, or being a nurse is one of the most stressful. But when all of a sudden you bump up to the number one most, then that gives people great pause. And that's really where we're at right now.
Yeah, without some significant counterbalances to that, I mean, people who go into education similar to nursing, they're caretakers. A lot of them have a certain, personality type or an outlook. But again, without the counterbalances or some of the upsides to offset that situation, I can absolutely understand both the folks not coming in and then people choosing to leave early.
Absolutely. I think that, we have large systemic problems and there's there's not a lot of right now great solutions that are coming to the table to really try to address this. I'm sure there are groups and there are districts and certain schools that are doing certain things, but in general, there's not been put forth yet a really great sort of national solution to this. Last year when the NEA, the National Educators Association, did a poll, they polled 3,000 teachers. And of those 3,000 teachers, nearly every one of them said that burnout they considered to be a serious problem or an occupational hazard. And more than half of them indicated that they would be planning to leave the field earlier than they had expected. So when we talk about burnout, sometimes we have to level set what are we talking about? And we did talk about this in the part one series, but burnout is the chronic physical and emotional exhaustion that results from feeling that you are no longer good at your job and that nothing that you do matters. It just doesn't make a difference. And that is the definition that's been adopted by the World Health Organization. And we know that burnout has serious mental and physical health consequences. So we know with burnout, we oftentimes see depression and anxiety. And those are, you can read endless anecdotal stories of teachers talking about going home, being in tears, having panic attacks, thinking that they're having heart attacks, not being able to shut it off. So that's an indicator of burnout. So you get in the car to drive home and your mind just doesn't shut down, or you're not sleeping well, you're not eating well, you've got no time for self-care. Those are all the red flags that you might be in burnout. So burnout is essentially chronic stress that's gone awry. You don't really get a break from it. So when you think about a job like that, if I said to you, oh, you're going to work at this job and you're never going to be able to turn it off and you're not going to sleep well, you're not going to have any time for self-care, you're going to be less engaged with your loved ones, your family, your kids, want to sign up. And by the way, it pays about $40,000 a year. We have these problems that have a lot of implications in terms of teacher salaries. That's definitely cited as a very high risk factor in terms of risk to leave the field early or not even enter it in the first place. So salary is a huge issue. But also just the poor mental health outcomes are issues. It's interesting, before I go into the list of things, that makes the profession maybe unappealing to either stay in or even enter into. One of the things that happened during the pandemic, right? Because there's a lot of fallout when I say during the pandemic. So the height, right? 2020 to the end of 2021. So for that period of time, and certainly can be beyond that, but that was the really intense period of time, teachers were all of a sudden appreciated. They were like regarded as, heroes and frontline workers, and parents very quickly, when we had to homeschool our kids and do those kind of things, had this massive appreciation for teachers. And I think the next level of that, we also had a huge systemic appreciation for how many tens of thousands of students sometimes get one of two meals a day at their school, or how many kids went unreported in terms of abuse and neglect because there was no teacher there to see it and report it, or how many kids didn't get affection, love, attention because there was no teacher there to give it to them. So during the pandemic, this incredible regard for teachers came through. It was like the love was pouring and pouring out for them, and the appreciation was there, which was great. And then when schools opened up, and then things started to go back to the new normal that we are now in, all of a sudden, interestingly, politics played a huge role in the profession. So all of a sudden it was back to, we don't like what you're teaching. We think you're morally corrupting our kids. We don't like critical race theory. We don't like these race issues. So all of a sudden, the climate of politics happened to really just have this huge intersect with education. And some of the nation's leaders who had these strong opinions started really putting that out there. And all of a sudden, teachers and parents and teachers and communities were pitted against one another.
And at the same time, coming back to school after the pandemic, I mean, the impact on students, on families, on the teaching environment in general, that's significantly changed and heightened a lot of the stress and just responsibility of students or of teachers who are coming back to the classroom, yet that it's almost like business as usual, but with even more stressors on them, without the recognition that this job is significantly more challenging than it had been pre-COVID, even if, COVID itself is, not the pandemic, or we're not out of school like we were before.
Absolutely. I mean, there's several factors that when teachers returned back have been reported. So things like high rates of depression and anxiety, low morale, teachers being able to not, kind of have that boundary set where they feel like they have more work, more accountability, more standardized testing. And so the school day doesn't end at 3 o'clock for them. The workload really increased. A poor kind of school climate and school morale, increased class sizes. That's been really huge. And low administrative support. And I think that's really, I'm sure that's the hard one to talk about. But when administrators either quickly side with parents that are complaining about things, or they continuously put more on their workload and caseload, teachers feel unsupported. And so you mix all of that in with 2/3 of teachers saying that the pay that they get is barely sustainable to even have, a very basic lifestyle. And we have a crisis. And we have a crisis of a mass exodus of teachers leaving, which directly impacts kids' mental health.
Absolutely. My sister is a teacher, and she's a great teacher, but we have a family text chain, and it's constantly, it's almost like her mental health support. We're hearing about all of the things that you just said, and she's really working them out with us, and it's very real.
Absolutely. So if she were, didn't have that kind of support, not everybody has that, right? So if she were alone, if she was lonely, or just, didn't know how to reach out to others, her state of being, she might have quit by now, or her state of being would be really compromised, because it is only in community and is only with support that anybody in a very stressful profession can even get through. But we can't take for granted that not everybody has that kind of social support. One of the things that I think is a striking statement that I took straight out of an article is that this mental health crisis will take thousands, maybe tens of thousands of teachers out of the classroom before their time was up. And when we look at that level of a staffing shortage, um, there is directly a not sorry, let me do that again. When there's this kind of staffing shortage, there's a direct detriment to kids. And so when you've got these trusted sources, they're leaving. You've got either inexperienced people coming in, maybe people coming out of retirement, but that's much less likely, or just people who were not educators in the first place, never ever took an education class in their life, but now that's your sub or that's your long-term sub as a teacher. That takes away that sense of stability and that sense of emotional containment that a school provides. And we know that feeling emotionally and physically safe is a precursor to learning. So you can't have kids really learning and thriving and meeting their math and reading requirements and all of those kinds of things when they just don't feel safe.
Absolutely. Well, and I imagine with people who are coming in as subs or long-term subs, they're not going to be just picking right up where they left off. And so just getting through the curriculum, having consistent learning, along the line of what standards that they have to meet before the end of that year and to move on to the next grade. It just, I can't imagine. We might have a high schooler who has 2 subs right now and will call me and say, hey, we're watching this movie I've seen 15 times. Can I get checked out? And we say no, but we do wonder about, well, is he going to be learning what he has to get through this year?
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be clear education lags. I think, we all remember last year, meaning in 2022, when, the nation's report card came out. And people were horrified to see how behind in math and in reading American children were. So they will have educational lags. It's not if, and it's just when. And we see the immediate consequences. So interestingly, one of the consequences for kids is their social and emotional delays. So if you talk to any teacher, they will tell you, especially if they're experienced, the kids they have, no matter what grade they are, they could be second graders, they could be high schoolers. They'll say they are 1 to 2 years emotionally behind. A 4th grader's like a second grader, a 12th grader's like a 10th grader. Because you really need every single year of childhood is a developmental stage, even if it's within one. So there's early childhood, right? So that's 0 through 5. There's middle childhood, that's 6 through 12. And very distinct things happen during those stages, right? So that 0 through 5, if they were, maybe parents at the time felt like, well, my kid was young when this happened. And so maybe they won't be that affected. Well, no, because they needed to be socializing and playing. And, people, I think, sometimes really don't understand the role that play plays in the role of the formation of us as human beings. And so play was affected, and therefore social skills were affected for those younger kids. And certainly, just socialization and isolation was. And then you have those middle childhood kids who, it's interesting. We know that it's thought that if you experience high levels of stress, you go through puberty sometimes quicker. So you have these kids that are sometimes sprouting through puberty quicker than you thought. They aren't having the socialization. So all of those age appropriate things that happen in 3rd grade and 4th grade and 5th grade were like put on pause. Mm-hmm. And so each stage has its own unique social, emotional, and educational lags. And I remember in 2020 reading these initial reports when we were just sort of speculating what would happen. I remember reading one study that said, we think that this will take at least 7 years to catch up. So when you're talking about these things, educational lags, social emotional lags are a given. Students who are special needs, students of color, students of more disadvantaged backgrounds and minorities absolutely hit the hardest. If they don't have the resources at home to support that child, or they don't even have supervision, and in some cases they don't have 3 square meals a day, absolutely their educational lags and their social emotional delays will last for years. We're seeing increased student attendance. Decreased student attendance or increased student absences. And so in some districts, there's this huge push to try to get kids to school and on time, and you get all these reminders to send them in, and
Yeah.
the famous October 1 count is a part of this. So you need kids in the fall definitely to be there so that you can get the funding that you need if you're a public school. Like there's this snowball of effect which kind of results in kids who are acting out more, kids who have more behavioral issues, kids who are struggling, kids who are now resistant to go to school. They no longer maybe view school as that safe, loving environment that they are used to.
Even in the best of situations or circumstances during the pandemic, one thing that we in our family were really worried about is with the learning separated from the community, the engagement, the socializing. We were really afraid that they were losing their curiosity, and they just weren't like school as just sort of this place to thrive and to engage and to just turn on as people. Like that really was something that we just saw go down and down until we were able to get them back in school. And that was in the best of circumstances. We were both able to work from home. We were there, but it was terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think people might feel, I get it. Like people don't want to, for the most part, talk about the pandemic anymore, right? We want to move past it, and we are in a different stage. And the stage that we're in is okay. Yeah, we don't need to talk about maybe our experiences of the pandemic. People just want to move past that. However, we're in the fallout. That's the stage we're in now, where we're going, oh my gosh, this is the fallout. We have some major problems, and they need solutions, and there are solutions out there, but we have to have the dialogue around what has caused this problem. Why are so many teachers by the thousands leaving? Why do we have these huge gaps? And right now I feel like we're in a Band-Aid stage, right, where you're putting Band-Aids on things, and you're just trying to get through the year. And maybe we get a pass for that this year, right? So it's spring of 2023. And maybe we get a little bit of a pass for that. But in a year or so, people are not going to be as forgiving. Now we're going to be, a couple of years out from the pandemic, and it's going to seem like we should have our act together. We should have solutions to this. But I'm really here to say that between the mass exodus of teachers and between the youth mental health crisis that we're in, there aren't, quick solutions to these huge systemic problems.
Well, and then the sense of urgency to begin to talk about and find ways to address these systemic problems in light of the fact that fallouts usually last longer. So how can we make this not last even longer as the fallout effects of COVID than parity?
Well, I love that question, because I kind of just flip. There's lists of things that teachers report. Why do they feel burned out? Why did they either leave their field or want to leave their field? And so some of the things that they say are their salaries. That usually comes up about number one. So we need to figure out how to fund them differently, right? The hiring of more teachers. They want more teachers. They want more support. They want smaller class sizes. How do we figure out how to get that to happen? That, again, financial implications. They are asking for more mental health, behavioral health resources for their students. So again, that's not just a financial implication, but we also have a mental health shortage right now. So there aren't enough therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, school counselors to meet the demand, and not even close. So we definitely need a pretty significant train and retain model to be able to get the younger people trained and educated the way they need to. And the focus on the paperwork and the standardized testing and the massive focus on that is also reported to be a pretty high stressor for teachers. So are there ways that, yes, we can track how our students are doing, but without almost penalizing teachers or having them feel like they're teaching to just these standardized tests because that's how they, show their worth. And I think that's our calling. And definitely from my perspective is, how does a teacher sort of get the recognition that they deserve or show their worth through being able to provide a stable, loving environment in which kids can be curious, kids can ask questions, kids are engaged. To me, those are the master teachers. If you can have an entire classroom of kids, no matter what age, you can control them behaviorally, you can teach them to take turns, you can have them be curious. To me, those are the markers of a positive, successful educational experience, much more so than just looking at grades or scores on these standardized tests. So I feel like this is our calling to be able to say, how do we sort of rate or measure the social emotional piece that teachers bring to the table?
And like bringing in qualitative measurements in addition to these quantitative test scoring and benchmark metrics that all districts have applied to them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, you know, it's interesting. I think about where we're at today and what the school districts are doing in terms of filling in all of these vacancies. So the NEA, again, the National Educators Association, says that overall, nationwide, we have about 300,000 teacher and school worker positions that are open. So that was in the fall of 2022. It's just to keep schools literally open and going. There's been a lot of very interesting things that people may not be aware of that different states have done in order to do that, which does accomplish the goal of keep the doors open, right? So I don't want to take that away. You've got to keep the doors open. Okay, here's been some solutions. However, when we get like beyond just keep the doors open, there's a lot of concern about the fallout. So things that all around the country people are doing, they're looking at things like lowering the requirements for public school teachers. So you don't need all of the level of education to become a teacher. Changing rules around teacher certifications. In some states, just eliminating the need for a college degree so that it's not required to become a teacher. And other states have talked about making the teacher exams, the certification exams, easier. So lowering the bar there so that more people may be qualified in order to become a teacher. And I think we need to really think about what could be the consequences of those kinds of modifications.
Especially, I mean, my first thought when hearing that is to counteract the lowered qualification experience education on how to teach. How are schools making up for that with maybe their own internal training? Are there plans for that to make sure that not only are they trained and understand what it is to be teaching a student, what the requirements are, understanding the students at whatever development stage they're in at that point, that there are reasons that it is a profession in the first place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think when we're talking about adjusting these things to make the barriers for entry just easier, we have interesting things that already are going on now that can give us some of that sort of proof of concept to say, I'm not sure if these are such great ideas. Again, when we're in survival mode, which maybe that's just what we have to be honest about. We're just in survival mode. Maybe we're just surviving and not looking to thrive. My fear is that that's going to continue though. And I think anybody who's in schools and anybody who's an educator probably also has that fear that this doesn't feel temporary, that this feels like this could also become the new normal. So when we talk about those different things that, across the country people are looking at, there's some really specific examples of what states are doing. So in Florida, a law went into effect in July where military veterans without a college degree could earn teacher certification and become teachers in classrooms. So they had to have some in any field, just some college classes, so at any level in any field, and then they could go in and become a teacher. And that was very supported, like, the military, our military veterans, which, of course are amazing in the backbone of our country. This gives them great opportunities. And I think it does give them great opportunities. And I bet for some, maybe it will enter them into the field of teaching where they hadn't considered that. And now that it's accessible, they can do that. However, initially, our kids are going to suffer, and maybe even long term. If they never require teaching degrees, a teacher will say, you need at least 4 years, if not 5 years of education, plus a whole year of being sort of a, student teacher and being observed and getting that feedback in order to do this job. And I think about just in my field as a psychologist, I had 10 years of school, one whole year, well, many years of being, many years actually of being supervised. And then afterwards, 2 more years, even after I graduated, of still being supervised before you can get your license. If somebody came into my field, because we also have a massive shortage, and said, yeah, we're just going to change those requirements. Actually, we're just going to eliminate the requirements. If somebody was ever maybe a pastor or a preacher, or, they're just a good listener, they can be designated as a mental health professional. That would cause me great distress. And I would lose confidence, in the way in which things were going into the future.
And especially, not that educators are professionally medically trained practitioners like you are, but you've already covered how much of student mental health and just all of the things that come with that, especially after the pandemic, but just already before then, that they're having to support and be aware of and understand how to react and, be supportive of the students, making sure they're walking that line. I mean, it's not just a plug-in job by any means.
Not at all. I think when you're working with kids, there's so much to learn, and there's so much to learn even about their developmental stage. And so it even would go like, oh, I was a high school teacher. Well, I don't want to work with high school kids anymore. There's too many problems there. I'm going to become a kindergarten teacher. I'm sure the kindergarten teachers would say, you can't just come in here and just start taking over a kindergarten class, even though you're a seasoned, high school teacher. Like, that's why there's actual certifications for certain developmental levels. And so even within the field of education, even if you have a degree, even if you have a certification, you still can't just think you can go in and just teach anywhere. And there have been other alterations of the way that we operate in order to just accommodate just keeping schools open. In Arizona, a new law permits people to become teachers without college degrees as long as they're attending college and they get supervised by a certified teacher. So even though maybe that's a little bit better, that's still a really inexperienced, probably very young person who's kind of getting thrown into the fire. I mean, there's a reason why you do your student teaching at the very end. Like, okay, I've had some classroom experience, I've watched film, we've had lots of discussion, and then I'm going to go in, but I'm going to have a mentor, not just like go into it. In New Mexico, they announced a new initiative to ask the National Guard to come in, as well as state bureaucrats to come in and teach as well, just to address the shortages there. So we have, it feels a little bit like the Wild West in education right now. And again, because we want to keep schools open. But there's a lot going on. So I go back to it once again, whether you are a new teacher, an experienced teacher, you're going to be in an environment, you're going to be in a school building that is going to have this huge diversity of experience, of qualification, and that just doesn't usually lead to positive regard and to a positive climate. It leads to suspicion, it leads to less camaraderie, and people again just experiencing stress at extremely high levels.
Sounds incredibly fractured, with these different, the big takeaway in my mind from this discussion is, let's do what we can to make sure that the Band-Aid doesn't become the new normal, that 10 years from now, that's just the state of education in this country, and we can't remember how it happened.
That's right. That's exactly right. And mine too, really, as I, really studied burnout and how it affects professions and parents, and children as well. We do sometimes need to just do what we need to do to survive. And that's generally considered a short-term limited stage. And, just like you said, we can't make that the new norm. Our country, our kids will suffer tremendously academically, socially, emotionally, in their mental health. But really right now with the emphasis just being on how do we support teachers, school leadership. I mean, everybody's feeling the pressure. So even the people who I say need to be listening and on top, the administrators, school boards, they also are human. They're experiencing grief and loss and pressures and their own stressors in their own lives. So it's just really a time, I think, if you look at it positively, it's an opportunity for us to really say, what is this call to action? How can we respond to it in a really responsible way, in a thoughtful way? And yes, maybe it's going to take longer to build this, to get to where we want to go to. But right now, the opportunity is here to really relook at how do we get people excited about teaching again? How do we reduce stress? How do we support these teachers? So, as much as a lot of this can feel like doom and gloom, I also think there's really great opportunity right now as well.
Absolutely. And the point you made, just the humanity of what we're talking about. These are systems, but just always remembering that these systems are made up of individual human beings that make up those communities and those ecosystems. And, our approaches should always take that into account and have it top of mind.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Sheryl. We really appreciate you being here and this discussion. Even though it was heavy stuff, it's really important that these conversations are had. So we appreciate you being here, and we will look forward to our next session with you. So before we go, can you tell us where viewers can learn more about your services and the work that you do?
Absolutely. So in general, there's one hub. You can find me at drsherylziegler.com. And that's my website where it has my online course, my book, and some blogs. And you can sign up for a newsletter and kind of get, I don't send a lot, but just, some real insights as to what kids are going through these days. And on social media, I am at Dr. Sheryl Ziegler.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sheryl. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.